I'm Rob,
I'm Nate.
and welcome back to Rob and Nate Record a Podcast, and a unique episode.
Yes, this is our podcast.
Yes.
So I'm the bigger movie nerd of the two of us, and so oftentimes I tend to dominate a pod, especially if it's a movie I've selected. And I was thinking, because in our early plans for this, we were going to do movies and then other stuff, and other stuff hasn't really materialized much.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, what's something Rob's really kind of passionate about? You are the biggest podcast listener I know because of the type of work you do. You have the time for it, and you'll often, I think, you re-listen to these things a
Some
lot.
of them, yeah.
And I think part of that because when you're working and listening, you're not going to catch everything the first time. So like, there's more value to listen to it.
And there's certain, as we've established in our podcast, there are certain media I just tend to reconsume. There's movies I'll watch repeatedly. I re-listen to the Harry Potter books every single summer. I've done them every summer for like 8 years now.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's just some media I will reconsume. There's only a few podcasts that I've re-listened to the entirety of it, but it's not uncommon for me to listen to a specific episode of a podcast multiple times.
But I just thought this would be a good episode for us to do, for you to talk about your favorite podcasts.
Yeah.
And I'm finally starting to listen to podcasts semi-regularly.
Well, I've kind of pushed you into some of these because probably most every time we get together, it probably comes up at least once every time we're together.
Yeah,
Brian mentioned some podcasts that I've listened to, and I've sent numerous podcast recommendations to you that are things that are things that you have other interests in. And
yeah, because I mostly listen to things that are very kind of weekly, kind of movie or different kind of discussion podcasts, where you tend to listen to a lot of things that have an arc, that tell a story.
Yeah, they still tend to come out on like a weekly basis, similar to what we do. But I like podcasts that are deep dives into a subject. I listen to a fair number of true crime podcasts, and there's a lot of them out there that do a different story every week, and that has almost no appeal to me.
Yeah.
If you're just going to skim the surface of it, I'm not that interested in it. I can do a Google search. But if you're going to do an in-depth thing and do research into it and present perhaps a new perspective or, just the in-depth information, okay, now I'm intrigued.
Because I mostly, when I have listened to podcasts in the past, it's mostly been as I fall asleep. I talk about that golden spot where it's interesting enough to entertain me while I'm awake, but not so interesting that it keeps me awake, keeps me from falling asleep. But you have gone through, and I've listened to a few episodes of a number of the podcasts we'll be talking about, and there's a number of them I think I'll go back to and try to finish.
Well, and what I did when Nate suggested this was I created my top 5 podcasts of all times. And then I have a number of honorable mentions that we'll discuss much less in depth. Not that any of these will be super in depth, but I have a number of thoughts on each of the top 5s, and I will illustrate why they're in my top 5.
Let's get started.
So, of course, the very first one, as it's referred to in a number of the podcasts I listen to, the Pod Mother from Sarah Koenig, Serial Season 1. Now, I have enjoyed the subsequent seasons of Serial, and I have enjoyed the other serial production podcasts that have come out since, things like S-Town, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with, or the new one that just came out about the election frauds in North Carolina, the one that neither Republicans nor Democrats like to talk about, but yeah. But I've enjoyed the serial production ones, but the one that really started it all for me was Serial Season 1.
You're right. I like the idea of it being called the Podfather, because it is kind of like
Sarah Koenig is
think of a podcast, and it's like the first one that comes to mind.
Sarah Koenig is repeatedly referred to as the Pod Mother.
Oh,
yeah. But yeah, what all needs to be said about Serial 1? I'm pretty sure everyone listening to this is going to be familiar with Season 1 of Serial.
What's it about? Tell the people.
About the case of Adnan Syed, who was convicted of having murdered Hae Min Lee in 1999, which was also when I was a senior in high school.
I know. This is one that I've actually listened to all of, Season 1.
Well, and it's easy because it's only 10 episodes. I have subsequently listened to the much longer season on Undisclosed, where Rabia Chaudhry, his aunt, non-biological aunt, and 2 other attorneys, Colin Miller and Susan Simpson, do a huge in-depth deep dive into it, and Yeah, and a lot of things on the case, and they've done numerous seasons since then. That's all they do is wrongful
And they just talk about
convictions.
this one. Okay, but
That's all they do is
yeah.
wrongful convictions. And at least one of the wrongful convictions that they've covered in Undisclosed has since been released from prison, and there are pending court cases on numerous others that they've covered, several of which they have helped uncover evidence that is being used in their pending court cases to try and get these people released from prison. So, but yeah, Serial Season 1 about Adnan Syed. It's great. Listen to it. I haven't listened to it in a couple of years. I'll probably listen to it again at some point this summer. But yeah, it was good. And it's what led me into some of these deep dives and the rabbit holes. And I've resisted getting on Reddit, especially because of this type of stuff.
Yeah.
Because that would probably push me a little too far down the
time
rabbit holes.
suck. Yeah.
But yeah. There's not a lot else that needs to be said about Serial Season 1. But Serial Season 1 obviously is in the top 5.
Should we talk about whether you think he did it?
At the absolute minimum, there is no way that he committed the crime according to the state's theory. I genuinely believe he is innocent.
Hmm.
But at the same time, this has also led to some changes in the way I think about some of these things. I used to be one of these guys that if a guy's guilty, convicting him by any means is okay. I don't think that's the case anymore. If someone, the state, if their theory of the crime can be proven to be false and not accurate and simply could not have happened that way, why are you incarcerating people for the state's false theory?
So it's been a few years since I've listened to this, but I remember leaving it kind of uncertain. But one thing that did get me is there's no good alternate story for how she died. Like, there just isn't one. And that tends to make me think, who else?
There's plenty of other stuff that's come to light since Serial came out. Yeah, and there was even a recent HBO documentary series on this case. Yeah, there's a lot that came out. Right? He is. His conviction was overturned, and then I forget exactly what the judge did after that. He was denied bail after the conviction was overturned, and then I think the state is trying to get the conviction reinstated.
Well, so he's just in a limbo in jail?
Yep.
For how long has this been happening?
Like 2 years.
Wow, that's weird. That doesn't seem like that should be possible.
Well, so he was, even after his conviction was overturned, he was arrested for the crime. So at that point, once the conviction's overturned, you're still in custody, but it's like the trial never happened. So it's back to that point in the situation. So he applied for bail and was denied bail.
I don't see how he can possibly have a fair trial at this point. He's had so much media exposure.
Yeah.
I had a friend who kind of, online, this about something different, that basically said, we need to import jurors.
Yeah.
Like, you'd almost have to import foreign jurors.
Yeah.
Which doesn't seem right.
One of the big things on the Adnan Syed thing is the state, and this is part of why the Undisclosed podcast named themselves Undisclosed. The state committed what's referred to as a Brady violation. The state withheld evidence that from their cell phone expert, the person who pinpointed his locations, which is why the police, what the police used to convict him in the trial, and that's what the jurors said is why they voted to convict. They withheld the cover document from AT&T that said that incoming calls are not accurate for location data. Right. They never turned that over to the defense. And the expert witness who testified at trial as to the location data said that if he'd been shown that cover sheet, he never would have testified at trial the way he did. And he even testified at the subsequent court hearings and said, I never would have testified this way if I'd been shown this document.
Was this the only violation that it was it overturned on this? Or did they have a bunch of Brady violations?
There was other factors involved. Jay Wilds has made numerous statements since then. Jay Wilds is the guy who says that Adnan showed him the body in the trunk. Jay Wilds has made statements as recently as 3 years ago about the case. Every time it's contradictory to previous statements and things like that. They also eventually found the lady that they talk about. I'm trying to remember her name. In Serial Season 1, they talk about someone who wrote an affidavit saying that they saw Adnan at the library, but then she doesn't testify at trial. And the prosecutor says that he talked to her and she was forced to sign it. They tracked her down, and she testified at the court hearings that she was lied to by the prosecutor. He intentionally misled her, withheld information from her, and that if she had known that her affidavit that she'd signed for Rabia was relevant, that she would have actually gone and testified at trial. And that she still to this day maintains that she saw Adnan at the library at the time that the state claims that he was killing Hae-Min Lee. So, yeah. Yeah, and she's actually since then written a book, all of that type of stuff. So, yeah, evidently there's more to talk about in Serial Season 1.
That thing just is, like, has birthed so much children.
Yeah. Well, it's really genuinely fascinating, and I would suggest you follow up on some of this media. So Rabia Chaudhry wrote a book. It's worth reading. It's not the greatest book I've ever written, but it was good. The undisclosed season about this is super long. There's parts of it that are good, parts of it that I don't think it's something you would enjoy. You would probably enjoy the HBO documentary series about it, because it goes into, like, it follows his attorney as they're doing filings while they were filming the documentary.
There's also an HBO series, I think it's called The Night Of, that seems to be loosely inspired by this, with John Turturro as a lawyer.
Yeah, I'm unfamiliar with that one.
I guess this got to be on HBO Max. You might want to check that out.
Yeah, I'll look it up. Well, and these are not in specific order, but these are my top 5 in no particular order. But the second one I was going to mention was In the Dark Season 2. And this is the case of Curtis Flowers, a man who was tried 7 times by the same district attorney named Doug Evans for the same crime. This podcast it's in the same vein as Serial, but it does a significantly deeper dive. It does the deep dive into this case that people wished Sarah Koenig had done in Serial. You want to know how deep the deep dive was? The findings that this podcast finds, the findings of this podcast were referenced in Curtis Flowers' Supreme Court hearing that resulted in the Supreme Court overturning his most recent conviction. They were playing the recordings of the podcast in the Supreme Court hearing, and the justices referred to the findings of the podcast in their decision.
I would really, really like the top 5 podcasts of all the Supreme Court justices. I'd just be curious to know what they are.
Yeah, that I'm sure you would. But 2 of Mr. Flowers' previous convictions ended in mistrial. The rest all resulted in convictions that were then later overturned for prosecutorial misconduct.
And this guy
That's
kept
a lot of
prosecuting
prosecutorial misconduct.
And he kept getting reelected, right?
Yes, and he was actually reelected in 2018,
19?
Yeah, he's in his current term right now. But his most recent election, he continued to run unopposed. No one ran against him. And that's the primary reason why it's a small Mississippi county, and there's just not a lot of interest. But to have that many times, especially the same defendant overturned for prosecutorial misconduct, and a lot of them were overturned for what's referred to in legal circles as Batson violations, which is basically racial misconduct in jury selection.
Isn't that the kid that turns into Shazam?
No.
Oh, that's Bobby Batson.
Yeah. Yeah, and his most recent conviction was also overturned for Batson violation. In the wake of this podcast and what they uncovered and the things that they present about Doug Evans, the state of Mississippi finally took over the case from the district attorney. And the district attorney, Doug Evans, even after the most recent conviction being overturned, had expressed an intent to continue to pursue Mr. Flowers for this crime.
Is he free now? Is he still in prison?
So it was in 2020, in the fall of 2020, the state, he was released. So let me back up a little bit. Mississippi has a law that says that if you have 2 mistrials, you're automatically entitled to bail. Right. So since they then subsequently tried to prevent the state from using this law in Mr. Flowers' case, specifically why was they said that he was convicted multiple times in between the 2 mistrials. But if a conviction is overturned, legally it's as if it never occurred. So the only 2 trials that are on record in terms of the state, as far as the state is concerned, is the 2 mistrials. So Mr. Flowers was automatically entitled to bail, and when his conviction was overturned by the Supreme Court, it was a matter of months, and he was released on bail. Since he was released on bail, and the state took over the case, It was in the fall of 2020 that the state finally made the announcement and determination that they will no longer pursue Mr. Flowers for this crime.
Good.
And that's only because of the public pressure that came about as a result of this podcast.
And this was a crime that occurred in the mid-90s, right?
Yes.
And so he's 25-ish years behind bars.
He'd been in prison for 27 years, if I remember correctly, for a crime that he didn't commit. And there's plenty of evidence presented in the podcast to justify the statement that he did not commit this crime. And there's plenty of evidence that he didn't commit this crime, that someone else committed the crime. It's really an unfortunate instance, you know. Of course, the family has stated that they continue to support Mr. Evans because they've only been presented one side of this. Why would they want to listen to or look at anything that supports Mr. Flowers' case, you know? Similar to Heyman Lee's family continuing to support the ongoing imprisonment of Adnan Syed. So, yeah. The next podcast I want to discuss, one that I absolutely loved, and it really kind of changed how I thought about some other things related to the Forever Wars. It's a sub-podcast of Radiolab called The Other Latif. This was tremendously fascinating. One of the now hosts of Radiolab is a gentleman named Abdul Latif Nasser. And Abdul Latif Nasser learns on a fluke of the existence of another gentleman named Latif Nasser.
Which he talks about, because I did listen to the first one of
Yeah.
this. That is the first time he'd ever encountered somebody else with his name, and when he first saw the email about it, he's like, "This is about me."
Well, what happened was he was just doing one of those Google searches where like you look to see if someone else has the same name as you, and he stumbled across this other. So he frequently goes by the name Latif, because Abdul is considered one of the names for God, and so if you're in a Muslim majority country, it's offensive to go by Abdul. So he has often gone by the name Latif Nasser. And so he's searching and finds another Latif Nasser. And this other Latif is named Latif Abdul Nasser. So it's much more common to use Abdul as like what we would refer to as a middle name. And he finds out that this other Latif is in Guantanamo Bay. And this leads him just kind of to spiral and want to learn more and find out what's going on. So the other Latif is a captive of the United States in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Our host Latif then goes into a deep dive of how the other Latif came to be taken into U.S. custody. Short story, he was purchased as a captive from a third party in Afghanistan.
Which happened back in the day.
Yeah. And then was, detained at this questionably held facility in Guantanamo Bay. And Latif Nasser, through his research, our host determines the fact that the official position of the United States government is that the other Latif likely never was a terrorist and poses no ongoing threat to the United States. That is the official position of the United States government, is that the Latif Nasser, who is being held in Guantanamo Bay, likely was not a terrorist and poses no ongoing threat to the United States.
Yet
he still continues to languish in Guantanamo Bay. Like, it's just this dichotomy that is the official government position, that he was probably never a terrorist and doesn't pose a threat to the United States, and yet they're still holding him in Guantanamo Bay. And that's
and the reasoning why they're still holding him.
Well, so they actually were preparing to release him during the Obama administration. There was a lot of rules in place about releasing someone from Guantanamo Bay, and his family went to great lengths to comply with all the requirements. They got the government of Morocco to consent to take him in and continue to monitor him, as is the United States policies in releasing people from Guantanamo Bay. All of this was in place, and it was in the waning months of the Obama administration, and just no one was willing to sign off on the paperwork because none of this happened until after Donald Trump was elected president. And with things in limbo between administrations, no one was willing to sign off on the paperwork. And then as soon as Trump took office, he refused to release anyone from Guantanamo Bay.
So other people have been released from Guantanamo Bay?
Yes.
Just a few?
I don't remember the number, but it's people in a similar situation. Obama, of course, created this review process, reviewing the detainees to see if they should continue to be held in Guantanamo Bay. And they put in place policies because there was other political implications from releasing someone from Guantanamo Bay.
Yeah.
And so policies were put in place that the government of the country where they're released to has to continue to monitor them. They had to have somewhere to go, family support, all of these types of things. They could not be released without support, and all that type of stuff.
And it's interesting, even a situation where the consensus is this person's innocent, there's still a reluctance to be, oh, you were involved with releasing a guy from Guantanamo Bay. So everybody's going to be dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's and very, very extra cautious, taking their time. And that's just one of the strangest, most I don't know if I can even call it really conflicted. It's just this weird legacy that there's these people going on 20 years now just in legal limbo.
Yeah.
Because nobody's willing to make anything official.
Yep. But this podcast, it genuinely does a great job of highlighting and dissecting the complexities of a multi-decade war and the claims the U.S. has long held on to regarding its own democracy and its influence around the world, and yet still operate a facility like Guantanamo Bay. It's a dichotomy that exists that is very difficult to justify. It seemed easier in the immediate wake of 9/11. Doesn't seem so easy 20 years on.
Yeah.
So, but it is a fascinating podcast. It's not super long. If you were interested in this, but don't want to commit, I wanted to say it was 6 episodes total. Yeah. But yeah, so much shorter, but fascinating, and our host does a great job of presenting things. The next one that I want to discuss, I'm not sure where to start on this one. It's called Running from Cops. Its host is a gentleman named Dan Taberski. This is a sub-podcast of Headlong. The first time I heard about Dan Taberski, this is why I'm unsure of where to start on this one, so I'm just going to start of where I first heard of Dan Taberski. It was when he made a podcast, also under the banner of Headlong, called Missing Richard Simmons. Because we haven't heard from Richard Simmons in a long time. So he does this thing, deep dive into what's happened to Richard Simmons. Is he... Yeah, I'm not even going to go into. I'm not even going to go into that podcast, but that podcast kind of made me wonder if Dan Taberski was a bit of a joke.
Yeah, can I take this guy seriously?
But there's some other podcasts that I respect and podcasters I respect, and they started talking about him making this Running from Cops thing. And so when I first heard of Running from Cops and that Dan Taberski was going to be making it, I thought it also was likely to be a joke. But as these other people started to talk about it and thinking it had some serious potential, my interest got piqued. So I subscribed to it, decided I'd give it a shot, and I'm really genuinely glad that I did. Dan Taberski, he interviews the Langleys, who are the producers of Cops, the TV show Cops, and he did, in the interviews with the Langleys, they accuse him of having come into this project with preconceived notions. Mm-hmm. And it seems like maybe he did have some preconceived notions when he came into the project, but nothing akin to what the Langleys accuse him of having. And to Dan Taberski's credit, he demonstrates a great willingness to challenge his own notions in the podcast and to support any findings that he comes to with ample facts. So he puts together a group of researchers, and as part of this project, him and his team watched in excess of 800 episodes of Cops. And as they watched these episodes of Cops, they cataloged a large number of data points in spreadsheets so they could cross-reference these things. And they used the data from, that they cataloged in these 800 plus episodes to come to certain conclusions. They also then contact some of the police officers and individuals who were arrested on Cops and interview them and talk with them about the data that they found as part of their process to reach their conclusions. And it highlights a lot of issues with the TV show Cops. I used to be a big fan of the TV show Cops. I can never look at a show like that or Live PD the same again. Yeah, it highlights problems with interactions, like the producers spur additional interactions. Like they tell the cops after they've arrested somebody, like, this segment isn't long enough, you need to keep talking to this person. Mm. It also makes some great points, like there's no such thing as consent when you're in handcuffs. Like, how can somebody consent to be put on TV when they're in handcuffs? Yeah. It also asks great questions about the common perceptions of cops. Some of those are things like, how can a show be considered reality when one party is given full editorial control over the final product. And Mr. Taberski also highlights instances when conclusions are provided via the police officers in the TV show, and things like roadside drug tests in particular. Mr. Taberski then provides specific examples of people being shown being arrested on cops as a result of a roadside test, then follows up on the cases to discover that proper lab testing, like the actual lab testing that would be relied on at trial, found that the substance in question was not drugs, and all charges were dismissed. Now, after that happens, cops never once corrects this. They continue to, even well after the cases are dismissed, cops continues to air these episodes, and nothing is questioned, nothing is updated, and it continues to negatively impact the lives of some of the people, in the episodes and their interactions, and having it aired on TV. Like, one gentleman stated the name of his employer, and he wasn't terminated for what he was arrested for. He was terminated because he stated the name of his employer, and no one redacted that and bleeped it out of the episode. So when the episode aired, his employer got negative publicity. Wow. And it led to him then being homeless and unable to find a job since then, and is still homeless to this day. Yeah. So, after listening to this podcast, you'll never be able to look at Cops or Live PD the same way again. I don't know how anyone could listen to this and look at the Cops or Live PD the same way.
You mentioned something in a previous conversation we had about this, about the racial makeup of people on the show. And
there was questions. A lot of people assumed that there would be certain things about the racial makeup. One of the things that they find in this is that there is not a significant racial disparity in who is shown on Cops. However, there's a significant racial disparity in which segment people of different races will be. I forget the exact percentage, but you are significantly more likely to be... So Cops is 3 7-minute segments. It's a half-hour TV show, which in the U.S. is actually only 21 minutes. The rest of it's advertising. But if you are a person of color, you are significantly more likely to be in the first 7 minutes. But in the remaining 7-minute segments, they make up for the racial disparity in the first 7 minutes.
Oh, it's like that's the bait.
Yeah,
it's disturbing.
Well, and statistics show that if someone's going to tune out and not watch the entire episode, they're turning out after the first segment, the first 7 minutes.
And people are less likely to turn out when it's a black people being arrested in the first segment. That says a lot.
Yeah, but it's fascinating. Dan Taberski, since I wrote this, went on and made another podcast that was also tremendously interesting about Eddie Gallagher, the U.S. Navy SEAL, who was accused of war crimes. And there's a bombshell in the last episode.
And I'm hoping that he will take on one of the other reality behemoths that I don't think we really had the full story on, which is Survivor.
Oh, yeah?
I really want to see Survivor taken down because it's been on way too long.
Okay. There you go. I don't know if Dan Taberski's
Dan Taberski, do a Survivor cast.
Yeah, Dan Taberski, though, he's a legitimate journalist. If you see him attached to a project, give it the shot. His most recent one, I forget the name of it, but it was produced by Apple Podcast. It's no longer under Headlong. But Eddie Gallagher agreed to interviews and participated in the podcast. And the last episode of the podcast essentially admits to what he was accused of. He says that they intentionally tortured this POW to death they just performed medical procedures on him till he died. And he says that it was known and that they'd done it before and had done it numerous times, and it was on purpose, that they intentionally performed medical procedures on a prisoner of war until he died. So the last one in my top 5 is Bear Brook. This is an investigative podcast from NHPR, which is New Hampshire Public Radio. And to me, this highlights why it remains important to continue to fund public radio, as well as what public radio can and should be becoming. NHPR has also produced a podcast called Patient Zero and another podcast called Stranglehold, both fascinating podcasts. Very different subject matter for both of them. Patient Zero deals with Lyme disease, and Stranglehold talks about the...
lemon disease.
No, it deals with how New Hampshire has a particular hold on presidential politics.
Yeah,
and primaries.
Bartlett came in with a tremendous advantage being the home state governor.
Yes. Mm-hmm. But the case that's involved in Bear Brook It revolves around a group of barrels that were found in the woods in New Hampshire. In the barrels are discovered, there's bodies in the barrels, and they've been dumped in the woods. The police work to investigate the murders. It is determined that the people in the barrels were murdered, and they're investigating the murders, but are having trouble identifying the victims because they've been in the barrels for so long. Eventually, by working with forensic genealogists, the police are able to identify the victims in this case, and then further identify their murderer. The same techniques used in this case then were later used by other law enforcement agencies to identify the Golden State Killer.
Oh, wow.
There's a lot of significant questions in both of those cases and how they used that information to determine who the murderers were. And it also highlights how these are great investigative techniques, but it also highlights how we're in the wild, wild west of DNA. And there's really genuinely wide-reaching consequences to the availability of so many DNA analytic companies using your information before we really genuinely know how some of this will eventually shake out. You no longer have to provide your own DNA sample. All it takes is a relative participating in any of these websites, and you can be identified and or targeted. There is a lot of push right now by insurance companies to obtain access to some of these databases, because then they can start to determine certain things about their insured clients.
Susceptibility to cancers and things like that.
Yeah, even just issues related to cholesterol.
Oh, wow.
And adjust your coverage or premiums as a result, things of that nature.
Very Gattaca-like.
Yeah. It's a fascinating case, and it's a very well-produced podcast. And just touching on how this ultimately was solved, police cannot access the major databases like 23andMe, any of those types of sites. They cannot access those databases. But if you participate in one of those databases but not the other, and don't want to pay for the second DNA test because they are not super expensive, but they cost some money, there is a third-party website where you can upload your genetic profile, and then it cross-matches against the other sites. However, there's not very many controls over this third-party website, and there's no restrictions against police accessing this third-party website. So they take their own DNA that they have on file and upload the genetic profile to the third-party site and make familial connections. And that's how they, through the connections they make to family, that's how they track down the murderers in both this case, the Bear Brook case, Bear Brook State Park case, and the Golden State Killer case.
I would like to start a one of these DNA companies for the genealogy and call it Spit on Your Ancestors.
And there you go.
Because give them some spit and you find out who your ancestors are.
Yeah. So much more briefly touching on my honorable mention podcasts. The first one that I want to mention is Hunting Warhead. And the reason this is the first one I want to mention as an honorable mention is because this podcast was amazing. It would have been in my top 5 podcasts if it wasn't for the fact that the subject matter was so dark. I can't recommend this podcast to very many people because what this case revolves around is child pornography. The short aspect of this is that the police arrested the operator of a child pornography website and realized quickly that they have an opportunity to assume the identity of this website operator and keep the website going. Now, why would police want to keep the website going? Initially, it was to buy themselves more time to identify other individuals involved in the distribution of child pornography. Seems like a reasonable reason to keep the site operating. But where is that line? How long can they continue to operate this website before they are just contributing to the perpetuation of abuse of children? It
becomes kind of a Fast and Furious situation.
Yeah. And the journalist who's following this case and produces the Hunting Warhead podcast eventually kind of forces the hand of the police. They had made agreements basically to keep this quiet, and then the police violate all of their own agreements just because they didn't like the fact that he forced their hand, because they just were continuing to operate the website much longer than probably should have been operated. So, but Hunting Warhead, great podcast. But if that subject matter is going to be disturbing to you, probably skip over this podcast.
I'm not going to make a joke about this podcast.
Nope. Next on my honorable mentions, this is a quirky podcast. It's called Wind of Change.
Yeah, you're a big fan of this one. This was the one of the ones you seem to talk about the most.
It was fascinating. It really was fun. It's one of the funnest podcasts I've listened to in a long time. A lot of people will be familiar with the song Wind of Change from the Scorpions. If you're not, jump on whatever music service you use and look up Wind of Change from the Scorpions and listen to it. The whistling opening of the song is infamous. A lot of people will recognize it just for that. But the narrative of the writing of this song is that Klaus Meine, who is the lead singer for the Scorpions, wrote the song after being inspired by sights he saw in Germany, after the fall of the wall. But what if that's just a cover story? What if this song was written by the CIA to foment change in Russia? The hosts of this podcast go into surprising lengths to investigate whether this is realistically a possibility. They even eventually get Klaus Meine to sit down for an interview and ask him questions about it directly. This was Patrick Raddenkeefe, who now has published a book, and another podcast is coming out. His book is called The House of Pain. It's about I'm blanking on the name of the family that basically caused the opioid crisis by the producers of the opiates and things like that. Patrick Raddenkeefe is a legitimate journalist. Again, this is kind of in the vein of Dan Taberski thinking this guy might be a joke, but Patrick Raddenkeefe is legitimate. But yeah, this was a fun podcast, and for those of you who are unfamiliar, the CIA has done things like this in the past. They have sent musicians into other countries to foment change. There's examples. You can find them really easily with very simple Google searches. So it's not implausible that could have been the case. It's a fascinating podcast. Did you listen to any of it?
Not this one. No.
Yeah. So my next podcast I've already mentioned. It's Undisclosed. We already discussed it while talking about Serial. This is a fun podcast. It's not for everyone though, because it is 3 lawyers talking about legal cases. Because of that, there's times that it is so dense that I can see how it turns some people off. But as the seasons progress, they do a better job of making things less complex or better explaining the complexity that they get into and putting into layman's terms. But it's really good. And like I said, they've done numerous cases and done a great job in presenting their cases. So Colin Miller, one of the hosts of Undisclosed, his blog is the Evidence Prof blog. Because that's what he does for a living. Is he's a professor, legal professor, and he does evidence, like rules of evidence and things like that. His knowledge is so encyclopedic that he's referred to by a lot of people as legal Siri. So, yeah. The next one I want to mention is true crime bullshit. This podcast started out looking into the serial killer Israel Keyes. And it asks the question, how many people did Israel kill? How much do we really know about his potential crimes? But Israel Keyes eventually committed suicide while in police custody and while there was a lot of unanswered questions. In interviews prior to his suicide, he hints at numerous crimes, a lot of different things, and a lot of further analysis into these statements leads to more and more questions rather than answering any of the questions. A later season takes a bit of a detour, but I'd recommend his content about Israel Keyes, especially the first 2 seasons of this podcast. Those were pretty good. So, next one is Slow Burn Season 1. This deals with the Nixon scandals. It does a great job of bringing this into modern day focus and putting it into context of our current presidential politics.
Then current.
It's still relatively current. The current season, I believe season 5, is dealing with the Iraq wars.
This is one I started to re-listen to. I'd listened to the Nixon and the Clinton impeachment ones, and then I just finished the one on Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls, it's funny that I would listen to a podcast about it, but that was interesting because this is a world I know practically nothing about. And I'm looking forward to season 4, which is next on my list, which is about the craziest gubernatorial election possibly in American history, the 1991 Louisiana governor's race.
Yeah.
Have you listened to that?
Oh, yeah.
That I haven't listened to it, but I've read the story about it, and I remember when I first read about it, I'm like, this should be a season of like American Crime Story or something like that.
David Duke, ran for governor. The current season 5, has been good so far too. So, the next one I want to mention, Patient Zero. Again, it's another podcast from NHPR. This one deals with Lyme disease. We've all heard of Lyme disease. We all know that ticks are dangerous, but do we really know why? And how Lyme disease functions. These are aspects of this that now seems more relevant in the COVID world. You've likely heard of long-haul COVID patients. Yet people in a similar position with Lyme disease are dismissed and shamed. But there are long-haul Lyme patients.
Truckers with coronavirus.
There you go. These long-haul conditions have been around for a while, but it's only recently that many doctors are starting to take the long-haul conditions seriously. This podcast really does a good job of explaining why you should care. Great podcast. Again, another NHPR, another public radio one, and highlights why we should continue to fund public radio and what public radio can be becoming in this more modern media world.
Lyme disease is something that I hadn't really seriously thought about it since going to Boy Scout camps, because you're always afraid of the ticks because of the Lyme disease.
The nature of my job and some of the stuff I get into, I have to still do tick checks, and I have multiple times here at work found ticks on myself.
Oh wow!
Yeah. So.
Did that make you angry?
No.
Did it tick you off?
No. I fortunately I've caught them before they've really done anything. So yeah. The next one I want to mention is Gladiator. This podcast focuses on Aaron Hernandez, who was a tight end for the New England Patriots, and before that down in Florida under Coach Urban Meyer. Most people who know me know I'm not a big fan of Urban Meyer, but yeah, it goes back to his college days and many opportunities to help him that were pushed away and dismissed because they weren't convenient. Eventually he goes on to commit and be convicted of murders or a murder. Yeah. If Urban Meyer had genuinely cared about his players, he could have helped Aaron Hernandez, but instead he enabled him. It also highlights how a talented individual was allowed to squander his talents by the machine of the NCAA and the NFL. Very genuinely fascinating. If you're interested in the sports world and are familiar with Aaron Hernandez, you would like this podcast. So, next one I want to mention, also another public kind of radio type thing, is the podcast Ear Hustle. Have you heard of this one?
I don't know.
So this is a podcast recorded in San Quentin State Prison.
Oh, wow.
Much of the work for this podcast is done by inmates and formerly incarcerated individuals. It's a great podcast, and it makes the issues of incarceration relatable to its listeners. And it's genuinely fascinating. And it's had its challenges related to COVID, but they're continuing to produce it and have even that's also how some of the reporting of COVID in San Quentin prison has gotten out. So, yeah.
This is the prisoners do a podcast. Is that?
They're
involved in it.
Outside consultant who started it, and now it's largely done by the prisoners. So they do the editing, they do the sound design, production, all of those types of things. So
it's cool.
The next one, I think you have listened to some of this. It's called Done Disappeared.
This is fun.
This is a spoof podcast. If you're a heavy podcast listener, go try at least a couple seasons of Done Disappeared. It makes fun of pretty much every major podcast out there.
One thing that I've started to appreciate that it makes fun of, especially been watching or listening to those recent seasons of Slow Burn, the advertising.
Yeah.
There's so much incessant advertising, and the spoof ads that he does are really entertaining.
It's very on point, yeah. Much of that podcast, Done Disappeared, the initial premise was mocking a podcast producer named Payne Lindsay and his podcast Up and Vanished. But if you listen to a bunch of true crime podcasts, this podcast is great and you'll enjoy it and you'll laugh.
And you should also refer to it by its full name, which is Done Disappeared with John David Boner.
John David Booter.
Booter.
Yeah, produced by me, John David Booter. Edited by me, John David Booter. Yeah.
Music by John David Booter. And our theme song by Johan Johansson.
Yeah.
And me, John David Booter.
Yeah. The next podcast I want to mention, we're getting down to the very end of this, Dolly Parton's America. This was, again, another podcast that surprised me how fascinated I was with it, and also brought more appreciation to Dolly Parton for me. we both lived in Eastern Tennessee for a period of time. It's impossible to be unfamiliar with Dolly Parton having lived in Eastern Tennessee. But her influence and impact of Dolly Parton, it's, on the lives of so many people, it's undeniable.
And it's still huge.
Yeah.
For 50 plus years.
The more you learn about Dolly Parton, and the more you can't help but respect her and appreciate her and what she's done. She has led literacy efforts, and all sorts of things.
She's one of the top 10 most beloved Americans, I think.
And it's easy to see why, especially after listening to this podcast. But yeah, it gets close into her life, where her origins, her world, and just really highlights how this is Dolly Parton's America. She's a wonderful woman. So the last one I'm going to mention is Bagman. This is Rachel Maddow's podcast delving into the Spiro Agnew scandal. This was not one you were probably far more familiar with this than I was. And whether you love or hate Rachel Maddow, this podcast leaves you respecting her and her abilities. So if you think you don't like Rachel Maddow, don't let that be a reason you don't listen to this podcast. She dives into, like I said, the Spiro Agnew affair and explains it in easy-to-understand manner.
She's a very good explainer.
Yeah.
Kind of her signature things is the first segment on her show. They'll often start with something that doesn't seem related, almost like a Simpsons episode. They start with one thing, and then it turns out to be about something completely different. And she does that very, very well. So I've not listened to this podcast, but I imagine it'd be good because of her involvement and her style for things like this. And also, Spiro Agnew is kind of the forgotten scandal of the 70s.
And it was a crazy scandal, I grew up knowing the name Spiro Agnew and knowing that it was related to corruption and those types of things, but I couldn't have told you very many specifics. Set aside your political allegiances and give this podcast a shot. It really was that good. So, yeah. Those were my top 5 podcasts and some honorable mentions, and I think I've spent enough time proving that I am a tremendous podcast nerd. So,
indeed.
If you've got nothing else to add, I'm Rob.
I'm Nate.
And this is Rob and Nate Record a Podcast.
You left out our podcast. You could have cross-promoted.
That's the perfect outtake. Nice.
And they would always call into the local oldie station and request it, and they would never play it.
Yeah, I think you're right. Then maybe we do. Was it Hondo? Yeah. Maybe we will do Hondo.
Are we going to record the podcast?
I thought so.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get that.
This one's your baby.
Document pulled up on the screen.
You know how, the Magnificent Seven is based on the Seven Samurai? So there's a samurai film from Akira Kurosawa.
Uh-huh.
And then they made it into the Western, The Magnificent Seven, with Yul Brynner and others. They did the reverse with Unforgiven. They did a Japanese remake of it as a samurai.
Oh, really?
In 2013. Which now I kind of want to see.
I forgot where I had this document loaded. Now I've got it, and it's coming up. I guess these notes are primarily for me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to have little to say.
Boop. I actually haven't thought through how I want to introduce this. Any suggestions?
We can use our names and the name of the podcast.
You know what I mean.
I'll introduce it if you want me to.
Well, I just hadn't put any thought into how I was going to introduce it. Yeah, let's have you introduce it.
All right.